And today I'm speaking again with Dr. Steve Mason. Dr. Mason, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. We spoke about a month ago or so, and that was a great chat, getting to know you, getting to know a little bit of your background, and just hearing some of the topics that are near and dear to both of our hearts. So thank you for doing that. And wanted to give a brief bio. I gave a longer bio last time, so I'll move through this quickly.
Good.
Dr. Mason is a historian of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean world under Roman rule, circa 200 BCE to 400 CE, with a focus on Roman Judea. He's extensively studied the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus and Christian Jewish-Roman relations, and authored and edited numerous books on Josephus. He earned his BA and MA in religious studies at McMaster University in Canada. You earned your PhD in Toronto's St. Michael's College, with your dissertation being on the works of Josephus. But during that time, you spent a year at Hebrew University of Jerusalem and another at the University of Tübingen in Germany, focusing on ancient Judaism and early Christianity. You spent 2 years at the Memorial University of Newfoundland, and you spent many years at Toronto's York University with the Division of Humanities and the Department of History, and teaching Christian origins, as well as holding a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Greco-Roman Cultural Interaction. That's a mouthful. You also were the head of Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies at the Pennsylvania State University, and then York again. And then in 2011, you took up the Kirby Lang Chair in New Testament in Aberdeen, Scotland. And eventually you moved on to the University of Groningen, which is in the Netherlands. Since 2015, you've been the Distinguished Professor of Ancient Mediterranean Religions and Cultures in the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies. The University of Groningen is a 400-year-old university and one of the top 100 large comprehensive research universities in the world. There's a whole bunch more I could add to that, but I'll just read a couple of your book titles. History of the Jewish War, Orientation to the History of Roman Judea, Flavius Josephus and Flavian Rome, Life of Josephus, Josephus and the New Testament, Early Christian Reader, Josephus, Judea and Christian Origins, Flavius Josephus, Translation and Commentary, Understanding Josephus, 7 Perspectives, and Flavius Josephus on the Pharisees. And hopefully I didn't miss too many in that list. That's as I said before, that's a long bio. You've been very busy.
Well, thank you.
I love every time I read that, I think, wow, I would love to have that much background on some of the subjects that are near and dear to my heart.
Well,
I wanted to start with a quick icebreaker before we get into some of the meat of the topics. What are your top few favorite movies of all time?
Yeah, there are quite a few. I think I would say a couple of older ones. I mean, there are a few more recent ones that I really like, but I'm getting on a little bit, and there are a couple that I just remember as being sort of thinking at the time, wow, these really stood out. The more recent ones don't stand out as much, even though I really like a number of them. So here are 2 of them. One was called Hopscotch, and it featured Walter Matthau as a CIA operative who decides to leave the agency and write a tell-all book. And it's with Glenda Jackson as his sort of sometime partner. And he travels the world, thinking up schemes and ruses to escape his pursuers. It's in the Cold War still, so there's interaction with the Soviet Union, and just the sheer scenery, the travel in all kinds of different countries, and the witty dialogue. It's great. It's a really good film, and lots of shoot 'em up action as well at a couple of points, with Ned Beatty as a CIA kind of manager. It's really well done. So that was one. I mean, it's not very deep, right? But
yeah.
It was. But I really like the film. On the deeper side, I suppose you could say, is a Korean film. I think it was. Somebody who's watching will get the title right. It's The Four Seasons. It's either spring, summer, autumn, winter, or fall, winter, spring, summer, something like that. But it's a beautiful, beautiful film, and it was very, very moving when I saw it. Very sparse dialogue, unlike the other one I just mentioned, but just a brilliant film, sort of philosophical film. The other one I would mention that I enjoyed, I sort of remembered for years and just thought it was one of the most brilliant films I've seen, is a French film called Ridicule, and it's all about the pre-revolutionary France. But it's a brilliant film. It's very funny, but also very serious at the same time. Look at taking a close look at these salons where your wit was the most precious thing, and you had to be able to convey your wit somehow. So people would cheat sometimes, with like little notes, so prime themselves so they would appear witty, and and somebody ends up committing suicide because he's exposed for not being so witty. But the sheer pressure to be that good, to have the rhetoric at your fingertips and the whole skill of rhetoric reminded me very much of things you read about the ancient world, where rhetoric was the key thing, and all the effort put into, especially in what we call the second sophistic, this training to be a persuasive, entertaining speaker on any subject, to be able to move the audience. This film, Ridicule, I think really captured that spirit very well, and was about 18th century France at the same time. So those are my favorite films, I think, probably.
I love when I hear feedback like that, and there are movies I've never heard of before, because sometimes it's movies that we've all heard of, and those are movies I've never heard of before, so I'll have to look those up. So thank you for that. That's awesome. They do sound fascinating.
They are. I have to say that a lot of films, I have this reflex, I'm sure many others have it as well, that if I hear a film is really super popular, I kind of don't want to see it, like Titanic I never saw, and a couple of films like that. It's just somehow, I don't know what it is, but it seems when you see trailers of it, I don't want to get into trouble for saying this, but it's just not my thing,
Yeah.
There's something that makes you a little bit resistant sometimes to just jump in and say, yeah, fantastic film. Well,
Yeah.
Also, I think because I saw the trailer when these two people standing in front of an ocean liner, just standing there on the bow, like as if nothing's happening. But I've traveled on ships, and if you're on the Atlantic, you don't get anywhere near the bow without this ferocious wind, blowing you back. So it just didn't see. Anyway, I'm getting off track here, Tim.
No, I hear you.
Your question led me to that conclusion.
Well, it's funny you say that you didn't want to watch movies just because they're popular. It made me think of, I knew a gentleman years ago who, back when The Passion of the Christ came out, from Mel Gibson, and this was when I was a Christian, he just didn't want to see it because he didn't want to picture, like he had this idea that from that point on, it would be like that to him would be the real Jesus story. Like anytime he thought of Jesus, it'd be that, and he didn't want to do that to himself. So it's interesting. Before I get into the meat of things, I did want to ask, just for curiosity's sake, how are things going in the Netherlands with COVID? And I've heard there are some upticks in numbers. How are you all doing?
Yeah. I think in much of Western Europe, much of Europe, there's an uptick. My town, university town, Groningen, was spared much of the first wave, and I think we all became a little bit complacent. You hardly saw any masks around. There was a shutdown for a little while because it was a national shutdown, but the real problems were in the south of the country, and this is up in the north of the country. Now the second wave is hitting us much harder, and you see masks everywhere, and there are now orders to wear masks indoors in any building. Restaurants are closed again, and bars, things like that. So it's definitely having an impact. And where I live, I'd say much more of an impact than the first time through.
Yeah. Are you all having any of the pushbacks where people say this is either made up or exaggerated, and where people are feeling like it's infringing on their civil rights?
I think on a minor scale, there are people like that, and the Dutch generally are very independent people. They like to live their lives without a lot of control. But I think there's also in the national ethos a sense of trusting the science and being reasonable, being rational. So that's very much part of the Dutch sort of atmosphere, I think. So I think people are generally quite willing to do what's required if it makes sense halfway, Yeah. But on the other hand, you do see people congregating outside, especially in parks and things like that. without a lot of social distancing. And
Yeah,
but on the whole, yeah, they do. People on the whole follow the recommendations. Yeah,
that's good. That's good. Yeah, interesting times we live in.
yeah. And
Well,
and there where you are, can I ask, how's it going there?
I would say that from my experience, a lot of people wear masks.
Yeah,
If you go to the grocery store, you expect to see pretty much 99% of the people with masks on. It almost strikes you when you see someone without it, and you think either they forgot it or they're just, kind of like, I'm not doing this.
yeah.
But by and large, it's been pretty consistent here in Atlanta from what I've seen. I
Okay.
do know that there's some pretty big pockets of the country where it is quite the opposite, where it's like,
Yeah,
it's almost like a conspiracy theory
yeah,
perspective of there's something bigger going on. We're trying to silence people, keep them from congregating for very specific,
yeah,
other bad reasons. And so I
yeah,
don't have any reason to buy into that at all.
yeah,
But
yeah,
I certainly see it, and it honestly kind of scares me, like to allude to what you said, the lack of science, of trust in the science.
yeah,
That goes pretty much across the board for those
yeah.
perspectives. The scientists are not telling the truth, and
Uh-huh.
that just is, once you cross that path, to me
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
a bit scary. But that would be a
yeah,
topic
yeah,
for
yeah,
another
yeah,
day.
yeah.
Well, I'll just say and wrap it up with that. I hope you all stay safe. Hope you're able to stay healthy in your family as well.
Yeah. You too. Thanks.
I do want to start today with a bit of a preface, and if you're willing to let me take about 3 to 5 minutes here. I know we're not here to listen to me; we're here to listen to you. But so I want to kind of say something and then get out of the way. But I do think it's good. We've had a lot of interactions behind the scenes, and I feel like some of that would be worthwhile to summarize. So I'm going to start with a bit of a prolegomena here. Dr. Mason and I have been in touch now for a few months, and I apologize for looking down so much. I'm just looking at some notes.
Yeah.
Dr. Mason and I have been in touch for a few months. We did a 2-hour video about a month ago, and we had lots of lengthy emails before and after that first video. And you have graciously answered a lot of questions from me, and probably inadvertently raised a whole lot more questions, which is good. My passions and talents are focused in large part around issues that are not necessarily at the core of what you, Dr. Mason, study and teach and write about, at least not currently.
Yeah.
What got me out of Christianity and helped me to realize that it is mythology and legend, what got me out by leaps and bounds was first the moral atrocities of the Bible, then the bizarre and nonsensical stories, but then it built up to a crescendo as I focused on the pagan origins and parallels that Judaism and Christianity used to create their belief systems and worldviews, such as the ancient Near East religions, especially ancient Egyptian and Persian religions, the Greco-Roman religions and mystery cults, then adding on mimesis with the copying, weaving in of Greek epic works into the New Testament, the heavy influence of Greek philosophies such as Stoicism, Neoplatonism, and Pythagorean concepts, as well as the use of Jewish midrash of the New Testament from the Old Testament, Gnosticism, Jewish mysticism, including Jewish cosmology and angelology, stuff like the Book of Enoch, the Ascension of Isaiah, things like that. And those topics and a few smaller but related ones like astrotheology, numerology, gematria, they fuel what is known as the mythicist position. That is the idea that Jesus was likely not a real man to whom legends were later added, but was likely a fictional myth that was euhemerized. It was given an entirely made-up history, although made up by gluttonous amounts of copying from other religions and mystery cults. There is a lot of drive and passion and opinion around the subject of the historicity of Jesus, the split being historicist versus mythicist, and I personally tend pretty heavily toward the mythicist position, as you know.
Yeah.
I hate to disappoint anyone whose curiosity just got piqued by my saying all that, because we're not now and probably not ever going to really dive as deeply into the subject of mythicism, into that debate as much as some would like, and as much even as I would like, and I'd like to just explain why. First, most of Dr. Mason's research is not focused on the origin of Jesus or Christianity. Your most intensive and long-term research is about Roman Judea, its governance, wars, the Judeo-Roman relations, etc. And also, we're not going to approach these subjects, even when we do touch on them, as a contest, because we're all here just trying to learn. There are professional and profound questions to pursue without trying to unduly polarize these topics and create division, especially when at the end of the day, we do agree on the big picture that this is not about a real God, that this is mythology and legend added either to a real man or on the other side, perhaps the far other side, an archangel crucified in the heavens by the archons of this age. There are some people, myself included, who do think that the gospel authors wrote astrotheological and numerological dynamics into their narratives, who copied from Greek epics, copied from other first century sources, including Josephus. And we want to understand more of what those authors were up to when they did that, and to explain what their reasons were, and to try to explain the narratives in a plausible historical context of those authors' belief systems and worldviews. And Dr. Mason has acknowledged, of course, that I'm free to do so. And I want to acknowledge, conversely, that you are free to not focus or put heavy weight on those same questions, but to pursue other questions that seem to you, after decades of immersion in Eastern Mediterranean languages and literature, much more interesting and promising. And I acknowledge that all of us who are in these pursuits need to avoid the kind of narcissism that projects our concerns, our focuses onto others, and holds them responsible for not dealing with our questions or accepting our perspectives. And we need to let all the different kinds of flowers bloom. Almost done here. After 40 years of deep immersion in the philosophy and method of history, the ancient world and its languages and literatures, its cultural reference points, via archaeology, numismatics, etc., with your focus on methodological soundness, someone like you, Dr. Mason, will have a very different sense of things, of what is plausible, what is of interest to study, and what it means to do history, than someone like myself, despite my talents or interests or passions, whose work has mainly been training in a different field, that is evangelical biblical hermeneutics and pastoral ministry. That's not to imply that every PhD in a specific field is always right, of course, but someone who has an intimate knowledge of the primary texts in their original languages and manuscripts, variants and contexts, who actually has to deal very seriously with these texts, is going to see it very differently than lay people who simply advocate different hypotheses. Just because we all read books, even lots of them, doesn't make us historians. That does take long years of training and experience in the material. A big part of the context to these topics is methodological soundness. People trained in other fields tend to think deductively in terms of syllogistic logic, and that is not what history is about. We have to understand the importance of knowing and understanding what our sources are. The unknown variables of these sources are nearly infinite. We need a different way of thinking, which can only be acquired slowly and patiently, and after serious contemplation of the very considerable problems of doing ancient history. For example, a historian cannot simply read Josephus at face value. We have to understand the type of world that produced Josephus and the type of writing he gave us. With all that as my starting point, I do want to acknowledge very clearly Dr. Mason's willingness to patiently field some of my questions, especially his perspectives on mythicism, while also guiding me and hopefully our broader audience into a bigger perspective on some of these issues. And you have been gracious beyond words in your willingness to interact with my questions and other questions through me. I finally just want to acknowledge that just because you don't address every argument or concern put forth by mythicists, myself or others, you still have respect for us, for our focus, our concerns, our insights, and why we think that this is such a primary issue, even though to others, like yourself, it is emphatically not a primary issue or a major crossroads. You've expressed to me offline and publicly in your essays that you have a great deal of respect for the people researching these issues, and that there have been times when you would have addressed some more of the mythicist perspectives, specifically as it relates to Josephus, but that you were constrained by the requested word count maximum or time constraints and by the sheer number of arguments and ideas that you were asked to address in your articles. You've clarified you have nothing against mythicists, and you certainly do entertain some of the proposals that we bring to the table, but that is simply not your focus, and ultimately you're not vested in or heavily concerned with the idea of whether there was an original Jesus Jesus character at the origin.
Yeah.
Again, you've been exceptionally gracious in fielding my questions. I appreciate your expertise, as well as your heart of kindness that you've exhibited as you try to help many people at many points on the spectrum of Josephus and Jesus studies without feeling the pressure to make things black and white that do have gray areas, that have nuance. And I appreciate that someone at your level is willing to address some of the questions that I and others who are diligently studying these subjects feel very strongly about. And despite our similarities and differences, your perspective and insights are very valuable to us. We deeply appreciate you, and I hope to continue the conversation for as long as we can. That was my intro. I apologize for it being so long, but I wanted to make sure I shared some of my heart in this, and also to give some others the context of what some of our emails have been about behind the scenes. So at this point, I'd like to stop talking, turn it over to you, and I know you had some introductory insights to start us off with.
Thank you very much, Tim. I am especially grateful that you so thoughtfully summarized the nature of the interchange that we've had offline. That's extremely helpful. And I'd like to, if I can, build a little bit on that already as my introductory remarks, because what I'd like to do is address some of the challenges, the questions that you reported from the website, and a couple of your own, perhaps, if we have time, in addition to that. So the background, what I'd like to add to what you said is, I very much like a clever, I think, remark I've heard that some person said. There are two kinds of people in the world. Those who think there are two kinds of people in the world, and those who don't. I am decidedly, as you will know by now, on the side of thinking that there are not two kinds of people in the world. There are at least close to 8 billion kinds, times however many different people we can all be. We can tolerate being within our own selves through change and through different roles. So, tens of billions of possibilities of human existence, even now, today. So I don't think there are just two kinds. And this is a real trap. This is a real trap. And I think I see it in the challenge, or a couple of the challenges that you passed on to me. We'll get to those in a minute. If you come out of the evangelical church, you'll be familiar with this kind of dichotomy. Probably most of your viewers will have heard then, Jesus was either some kind of liar or lunatic on the one side, or he was the Lord. And so what apologists will do is they work away at the negative side. Say, well, we can show he doesn't have the traits of a lunatic or a liar. And same with the apostles who died for their faith. So therefore, there are only two possibilities. And once you've made that assumption, the only thing left is to get down on your knees and say, okay, then he's the Lord. Like I multiplied by 2, carried the 4, divided by 6. I came up with the conclusion that's wrong. Okay, so now I worship him as Lord. Of course, that's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And you will have heard somebody hold up the Bible and say, either this is the inerrant word of God, or it's a bunch of, rubbish. We can just throw it out. I can still visualize, preachers sort of making the motion of just let's heave it out, or it's the inspired word of God. Well, that's not true. I mean, the point is there are many options, countless options between those two possibilities. So here, if I may, a quick reference to logic for those of your viewers who are into, who've studied reasoning. There's something called the law of the excluded middle, which means that if you say go into a small town and you know for sure that in this little town there are only two kinds of people. There are either Protestants or Catholics. I've actually lived in Newfoundland. That's how it used to be, where I first taught. And in a couple of small towns, there probably still is. There are only either Catholics or Protestants, and people indeed registered as that. Also in Germany and in some European towns, especially in the past, small towns, that might have been the case. So in that environment, if you could prove that somebody was not a Protestant, they were Catholic, because those are the only two options. But you go to New York or Toronto or Chicago and you say, right, if you're not a Protestant, you must be Catholic. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because, of course, there are all kinds of other possibilities. I mean, everything: Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Jew, atheist, agnostic, Jain, Sikh, just everything, every possibility. So the fact that you can disprove the negative doesn't prove the positive. And so there you move from the law of the excluded middle into the fallacy of the excluded middle. That is, you are excluding all the middle possibilities and making it into a binary choice. It's either a 1 or a 0. It's either a this or a that. And what I saw, the reason I raise all of this is the first challenge that you presented to me was one of your correspondents said that I think he was talking about me as an apologist. And I thought, wow. And then that was followed by some lies that I told, allegedly. Apologist, how can I be an apologist? What am I defending? I have nothing to defend. I was just talking about my work. The only sense in which I'm an apologist is that I'm a Canadian, and Canadians apologize overmuch for things, and I tend to do that. So I'll apologize for not being very clear in my statements. But I need to stress this, that what I was talking about was indeed exactly picking up on what you described of my work so graciously, Tim. Yeah, I have a job, a daily job. And in that job, I'm doing, I did focus for some years, for first 7 years, teaching Christian origins, wrote some things, published some things on it. But then for the next 10 years, I was not really in that field at all, working on the Roman Empire, Eastern Mediterranean, Roman Judea, Josephus. I was back in Aberdeen for 3 years of the time there, focused on teaching again in depth Christian origins. But then the last 6 years, not so much, well, not really at all. What that means is that although I'm thoroughly trained in, and I've taught historical Jesus and trained in the subject, I have to do other things. And because I'm a historian, not a theologian, I have to use the same methods that I use for other texts. And so, for example, with Josephus, there's always a question, did this thing happen or not? So you have criteria. There's always a question, is this passage authentic or not? So you have criteria. There are normal criteria that we use when we're reading Cassius Dio, Tacitus, Livy, anybody, any historian, ancient historian, any ancient text. And of course, the whole logic of history is you have to be consistent. You have to apply the same standards to this thing that you apply to that thing. What's good for the goose, good for the gander. You can't just go arbitrarily changing it because you have an impulse or hunch or a feeling about something, or this doesn't sound right to me. You have to have criteria that you can then present. So much of my life is in the thrust and pull and parrying of academic life, which is a kind of a blood sport. You have always lots of, every single academic around you is trying to pursue their own research agenda. So wherever you brush up against theirs, when you present your case or you ask your questions, you can count on it. They're going to push back and sharpen, they're like in the old days where you sharpen a razor on a whetting a strip, it's like they're honing your views, because they're not going to tolerate, you can't get published and you can't teach things, also with very bright graduate students, if people are constantly challenging and pushing back and say, why do you think that? What's the method? What's the, what's going on here? And the reason I stress all of this is what I was trying to say in our interview, and I think I kept coming back to it all the time, was not that X is wrong, or trust me, I'm a historian and my view is Y. No, I don't think I said anything remotely like that. What I said was repeatedly, when the mythicist option came up, namely that there was no guy named Jesus at the bottom of all this, I simply said that it may be. I don't have a stake in that question. What I'll tell you simply is it doesn't help me in my work. And unless someone else is doing my work, which they're not, that's the end of the discussion. I mean, precisely as you said, we have to respect each other's space. I'm not trying to tell anybody else what they should think. I fully respect and I understand, and I'm happy for others to think what works for them at their angle and level of immersion in this stuff. I'm simply saying, as someone who had to stand in front of a class and teach, each of Paul's letters for some years, working through them one line at a time, trying to figure out the historical context and what prompted them and all that. It doesn't work for me. It doesn't. And then the Gospels in the early, this third generation, fourth generation, the Ebionites, the Valentinians, the whole business, the whole thing. It just doesn't work for me. It's an option. It's an option. And I'm willing to test the hypothesis. It just doesn't work for me. That's all. If it works for other people, excellent. You know, so this is really important to understand. I'm not an apologist for anything. You invited me here to last time to ask me about how my work bears on questions of interest to you, and that's all I was doing. But I'm certainly not a preacher of any kind. I know what it means to be a preacher because I was one for a couple of years back in my 20s, but I am not anymore. And the life of being a historian is, for me, much more satisfying, fulfilling.
Mm.
So where does that leave us with, let me take, well, shall I give it back to you, or shall I pick up one of the questions?
Well, if I
you
could,
posed?
I want to be very careful to not sound like I'm playing devil's advocate or to pick a fight. I did just want to ask you though, just a little bit of a clarification question.
Yeah,
The issue of Jesus existing, if there was a guy at the beginning,
yeah,
it doesn't matter to a lot of people because they're, as you said, you know, there's other focuses for work or whatever. But however many Christians, and I forget the number, but you know, whatever, the millions and billions of Christians on the planet, it would matter to a lot of them. Obviously,
yeah,
you know, if you, a lot of them probably never even heard of the theory. They're like, of course Jesus existed. That's, you know, this, there's no such topic.
yeah,
But if you could introduce them to the reasons why there might be an argument against it,
yeah,
and they would obviously have a little shock value. But
yeah,
if they could actually entertain the idea instead of just discounting it, it would immediately be a pretty big issue. And they'd say, if they're honest with themselves, in my opinion, they would say, I need to address this one way or the other. I need to know, because if there was a guy, at least then the rest of the story can be true. But if there wasn't a guy, then this is different than what I thought it was. And you know,
yeah,
what are the implications of that?
yeah.
Does it, I guess my question might be, does it compel you at all ever to say, like the Josephus studies, with all the intensity and the details and the history that you bring into it, and the textual criticism, it ultimately doesn't go to a huge audience. Like there's a lot of people that depend on your expertise, and to them it's a very big deal. But when you
Yeah.
think about, you know, the millions upon millions of Christians,
Yeah,
they don't care who Josephus was. A lot of them don't even know who Josephus was. I don't think I really knew much about him until I went to Bible college. But the issue of Jesus, that's the bread and butter of everything.
yeah, yeah,
And so does it ever compel you to have a stake in the game purely because of how much it means to other people? Not to say
yeah,
that anyone's selfish to not pursue that line of thinking. It's, you know, you know, we all live our lives based on what we feel we're drawn to, but just
yeah,
the fact that so many people depend on this one thing,
yeah,
Jesus
yeah,
is Lord and Savior, and he's real.
yeah.
Do you ever feel drawn into that, just to say, hey, I want people to live an examined life. I know that you don't have all the information. Therefore, let me add some things to that discussion. Does that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the issue, it's not exactly your issue, as you said in your introduction. We touch in interests, but they're not coming from the same angle. So I'm going to try to say three things very concisely, if I can. The first thing is, I'm not sure what's at stake precisely here. So what I mean is, in the distinction between two options, whether there was a guy named Jesus who lived, and all of this, let's call it for shorthand, mythology, was fathered on him, was foisted on him. I'm not sure what the difference in terms of unsettling Christian believers is between that and saying he didn't exist. Because what I mean is, we know for sure that there were lots of guys named Jesus
Right.
in the first century. It was a really common name.
And lots of
Yeshua is an abbreviated form.
lots of
Lots of
apocalyptic prophets too, right?
I'm not so sure about that. Maybe we can talk about that question. I'm not sure about that. But you know, whatever he was, suppose the guy was maybe not even apocalyptic, maybe it's just like a stoneworker, I don't know, or just a really nice guy. You know, just treated people very kindly and shared food and things. I don't know, just suppose he was a guy named Jesus. And all this stuff was put on him. I don't really understand what you're saying is, if I understand you, Tim, okay, this matters to Christians. Well, I would say my perception is it matters who Jesus was. If there's a radical disconnection between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith, to use a scholarly formulation that's quite common, well, it seems to me that's just pretty much exactly the same situation as saying there wasn't, this particular guy didn't exist. And what I was trying to say last time was, for me, that option that he didn't exist is certainly one to be but it's been taken account of all the time. And here's the second thing. When you come from a church background, and you've been told this whole counsel of God thing is a neat picture of the whole business: soteriology, ecclesiology, anthropology, whatever, Christology. It's all just a seamless web, and outside of that web is darkness, right? I mean, this is the ball of light, and this is in which you live and move and have your being. And then outside that is just dreadful misery, suffering, darkness, godlessness, right? So I fully understand, because I've gone through it, the idea that if you leave this, being a child of light, and you go and join the children of darkness, you're going to you might be drawn to another whole package, right? Which says, no, it's all made up. It's all, he didn't even exist, right? But here's another case of that false choice. I think what I was trying to say last time is, from my work, it just makes better sense. It's easier, it's simpler to think there was a guy about whom everybody disagreed later. And why do I think that? Because it's extremely common in human life, especially when somebody dies. And this has actually happened to me among people I've known in the past few years who have passed away. There's actually then a struggle that takes place. It's sort of almost inevitable human nature. It can be, on the one hand, family members saying, this is the real person. And for example, what to do with their library if they're an academic, where's the library go? Well, family members might say, well, we should sell it off, or we should donate it to this place. Oh, some friend who was an academic will say, no, that he would never have wanted that. That's not right. He would have wanted it donated over here, or he would have wanted whatever, or she would have. So what I'm saying is, this is just such a common human experience that for me in my work, and the things I have to explain in the text, in all the texts, including Josephus, it's just easier for me it's the simplest explanation that there was a guy whose legacy was contested by his brothers, his closest students, a guy who didn't even know him, but thought he was talking to him in, the spiritual realm. That makes sense to me. It's harder to explain that radical diversity right from the start and the details actually of Paul's letters, for example, and the Gospels, if there just never was such a person. Because this is not a response, or it's not plausibly a response to one person's kind of schematic picture. And I'll come to that in responding to the questions. The other thing I wanted to suggest was that whereas we, coming out of the church, might say, wow, all this mythical stuff and symbolism and the number 153 in John 21, and wow, okay, I think this is all just a crock, I think it, or a fabrication, or somebody's ingenious, scheme. The main problem with that is that there's not just one scheme, there's a whole bunch of schemes. But the other thing that people should know is that for scholars, just because you didn't hear this in church, right? People, that's the common thing for people to say, I never heard this in church, right? Why didn't anybody ever tell me this? That doesn't mean that scholars didn't know it. And the one point I'd want to convey to your viewers is this is not news. This has been well known since the 19th century. There's a whole direction of scholarship from the 19th century called the History of Religions School, centered in the University of Göttingen in Germany.
That's like the Bultmann strain of things?
Bultmann was sort of the late and in some ways the fullest, most famous, definitely the most famous representative of that school. But it began, before his time and had a whole bunch of famous people involved in it, some of the biggest names in critical scholarship.
When you say it was known, you're referring to the idea that there were potentially pagan parallels and pagan origins of some of these dynamics?
No, not just potential. I mean, that's what these guys studied. That's what they did. So they did deeply investigative work into the mystery religions and Greek philosophical currents in the late 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. That's what it was all about. It was showing, especially Paul, to be a product of a kind of Hellenistic fusion, having borrowed so much from the mystery cults. There are lots and lots of books on this stuff. I was raised on all that. So it's not news. And there was one scholar in particular named Bruno Bauer, not to be confused with Ferdinand Christian Bauer of Tübingen. Bruno Bauer was a philosopher, theologian from Berlin and went to Bonn. He was a teacher of Karl Marx, and then he kind of ditched Marx and became a fast friend of Friedrich Nietzsche. And Bauer first began by trying to salvage Jesus from all of this stuff, right? To say this was all a later imposition. Jesus, just a nice guy. All of this later stuff was foisted on him. But he came to believe that the best explanation was rather that Jesus was a fabrication of this melange, this mix of mystery religions, cosmic symbolism, rising dying and rising deity, savior in that sense, requiring initiates to go through a baptism and transformation, all of that stuff. So that's what he came to think. And that's fine. I mean, what I'm trying to say is nobody has a problem with that. Who had a problem with it was the politicians and the church authorities.
Sure.
And in Germany of the 19th century, that meant he actually lost his license to teach, and he had to leave the university, which was a very common thing. People often wrote either anonymously or posthumously. They left their works, like Hermann Samuel Ramars left his works. He sort of kicked off the historical Jesus study and presented Jesus as indeed just a frustrated kind of prophet guy, whose followers then said, well, what are we going to do now? The guy died. We don't want to go back to like normal life. It's kind of boring. So they concocted this whole picture, but he couldn't publish this stuff, so he left it to Lessing, famous scholar Lessing, after his death to publish these fragments of his writings. So that's how it was in the 19th century, but it was not scholars who had a problem. What I'm trying to say is that what they were saying was every bit as discomforting to Christian believers as Bruno Bauer's. He was part of the conversation. He's saying, well, why don't we take it one step further? So, for example, whereas the Tübingen school had said that Paul's letters aren't all genuine. In fact, they would recognize only 4 of them as genuine letters. Today, most people will admit 7, but still say some of them are not genuine. These guys said only 4 of them are genuine. Bruno Bauer said, well, what if we said none of them is genuine? What if we said they're all 2nd century fabrications? That would allow me to say, the whole picture of Jesus is a late kind of invention. And that's a perfectly legitimate hypothesis. The question is then, these are people you can't imagine. If you haven't been among them. I've worked in Germany for 2.5, 3 years. If you haven't been exposed to German scholarship in any field, I mean, you have no idea how intense and tenacious and detailed it is. It's just unbelievable. And it's simply the case that other scholars say, a nice idea, but I don't think so. It doesn't really explain to me, this stuff. So they put forward their own proposition. So in sum, what I'm trying to say, Tim, is there's no, even though people coming out of the church will say, I never heard this stuff before, and now I see a seminar on all the, mystery religions and how similar they are to Christianity. I've been misled. The whole thing was, of course, Jesus was just an invention of all these guys. It's a possibility. But what I'm trying to say is that in the academic world, among historians who really focus on this stuff and live with it every day and have combative seminars where they're testing each other's hypotheses, it's been suggested. It's fine. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm simply saying that for most people, as for me in my work, it doesn't quite work. But on the other hand, those who've been in the church would be equally discomfited by the proposals of, Schweitzer or Reimarus or the Tübingen School or David Friedrich Strauss, whose Life of Jesus critically examined, presented it as the result of a mythopoetic, that is, people who lived in a mythical kind of mentality, even though the guy lived, but they projected all of this mythical stuff onto him. And the Enlightenment thinkers, Paine and Voltaire and Thomas Jefferson, all of these guys believed much the same thing. Jesus was a guy, decent guy, probably nice fellow to have dinner with, who had all of this voice. All of that is explicitly against the creeds of the church, so it's not, to take the fullest step back, to come back to where I started from, it's not like these are the only two options. You're either a Christ mythicist or you're an apologist for Christianity. That's absurd. There's been like centuries of free thinking, critical thinking research and scholarship, which has has all these other possibilities in between those two.
Yeah, I think what compels me a lot, and I think I'm speaking for some other people, is it is very personal in the sense of, if I was to use another illusion, if we were believers in the Wizard of Oz, and someone were to tell me all kinds of information, except they didn't tell me that there's a guy behind the curtain. And they said, look, this is a projection, this is an image, this isn't real. But the minute that they pull that curtain back and say, that's where this started from, like this wizard guy who's pulling levers, this is the real story. That is very compelling in the sense of, it could be this, it could be that, there could be a real guy, there couldn't be. But I think I think too, the idea of, from your experience, I'm sure, and others, when you escape, especially if it wasn't a very liberal Christianity, if it was like conservative, hardcore evangelical Christianity, and once you escape, you feel very duped and even very, I think, justifiably angry, because you're like, this was not, you guys did not tell me the full information. And one of the things I wanted to ask this way is, I feel like if you were to take someone who was really hardcore into Christianity, evangelical, and especially if they were conservative, like say they believed in evolution, or not in evolution, where they say the Earth is at max 6,000 to 10,000 years old. We know that if we theoretically could take them back in a time machine where they could see Neanderthals or whatever, their jaws would drop and they'd be like, oh shoot, I was dreadfully wrong. And once they see it, I think, and they, once they get back on their feet, they'd be like, I want to see the rest of this story. What else, go back further. Let's see and they want to see where the light began in the water. And it's kind of like that, where it's like, if I understand that there's like, it doesn't really matter in one sense if Jesus was real or not. And a lot of mythicists would agree with that statement, but it's the idea of like, this was such a mind job that we want to know what was really happening. We had the whole we had the Stockholm syndrome. We loved this man. and it was like he wasn't even there. And I think if when someone's, as people say, hey, I've done a lot of research, and I think I can give a pretty plausible explanation as to where this thing began, there is like that magnet of like, I want to see it. And my question was going to be, if you could go back in time, say there was a time machine, and you could be there at the early version, and you could understand all the languages, and you could hear all the early Christian sects talking, and you went back to like day one when the first person started talking, and if you found out, I'm not saying you would, obviously this is all conjecture, but if you did find out that it was akin to one of the mythicists' proposals, like say it was people just talking about an archangel named Jesus killed by the archons in space, and it somehow got you hemorrhaged, would that dramatically affect the way you do your Josephus work, or would it not make much difference? Or how much of a difference would it make to what you do if you became absolutely conclusively convinced that that was true history?
Well, the only way I could become convinced of it is that it would explain the evidence. I mean, I'm a historian, that's it. I think a big part of one thing that gets overlooked here, Tim, I think anyway, you can tell me if there might be something to this. A point I tried to make last time, but I think I did it very quickly and maybe wasn't picked up, is that you cannot do history, the history of something in which you already have a stake. You can't, for just the same reason that you must recuse yourself in a criminal investigation if you are, the accused, or that's your relative or something. You cannot do an honest, fair investigation of all the possibilities if you have a stake. And this, I think, is often missed because we live in a politicized culture, especially in the US, I think more than in Europe, and in the UK to some extent, where there are basically two sides, of everything. There are two kinds of people for almost any issue, abortion, capital punishment, taxation, government support, whatever it is, two kinds of people. So we tend to transport that into all fields. So in history, which side are you on? Are you on this side or that side? Well, if you're on that side, you would say that, wouldn't you? You have to get rid of, not you personally, but anybody has to get rid of this notion if you're going to do science or you're going to do history. You cannot do science if you already know in advance what the experiment's supposed to show. That's like people working for the tobacco industry and scientists, but being paid by the tobacco industry back in the bad old days, who very clearly made the results of their work, they presented them in such a way that they fit the industry's message that there's no demonstrated link between tobacco smoking and cancer. You cannot be a responsible law enforcement official if you are investigating a robbery, a murder, and you already know who did it. You think you have this powerful belief. You just can't do it. You have to recuse yourself. You can be a good historian of everything from 200 till now, and be an evangelical Christian. I've seen it happen. I've seen evangelical Christians who are actually very, very good historians of the American Civil War, or I don't know, medieval times. Fine, they can be super critical. They can be, weigh all the options. They can be fair. You cannot do it if you cannot be a historian of the first century if you already know what happened. That's the problem. And that holds equally for evangelicals, right? They cannot investigate the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus if they already believe in that Jesus rose bodily from the dead, because that requires some kind of cognitive dissonance that's just going to make your head explode, right? You can't do it. You just have to step back from that and say, okay, that's a matter of faith for me. I can't investigate it historically. The same thing with, anything else, Jesus' birth or so on. But it works not only for the evangelicals, it works for any invested position.
Hmm.
And that's the problem. And I think that is beneath the surface of what we're talking about. I cannot be a historian in the sense of investigating and weighing options if I already am committed to a position, if I'm an advocate, if I'm a preacher, if I am saying this is what you should believe about this. And that holds for Josephus, the Testimonium Flavianum, which we may talk about in another session. I don't know. I'm just a guy trying to figure out what makes sense. I have no time machine, no direct transport to what happened. I only look at the evidence and try to figure out what's the best explanation. No, it's the same thing here. So I fully understand what you're saying, that people who are invested and then have their lives blown apart want to have another thing to cling to. So if they knew that there was a guy behind the curtain, that they could see, that would somehow, I don't know, resolve tensions or something. But the problem is there is no time machine. We can't see the guy behind the curtain. What we have is evidence. We have remains from the ancient world that need explaining. And if I take up a position as an advocate and say, this is the explanation, even if it's not the Christ mythicist, if it's any other view, then I've lost, then I can no longer work in the field if I've become a champion of a view, which I must now defend at all costs. So I am exactly the opposite of an apologist. I am arguing that the only thing that matters is method, and that it's not the job of historians to believe stuff. That's the job of religion. History is not religion. It's not about believing things. It's about interpretation of evidence, understanding it, trying. We can never understand it perfectly, but trying to understand it first, and then trying to explain it, and always being open to any explanation of it that works. And different people will differ. Of course, that's the point about what works. Everybody brings their own other experience to the table, their own taste, their own weighing of the text, the language, if they know the languages of the text, and the resonances with other things. Everybody's going to bring their own background to it. And what scholarship is about is trying to get a space for, if you have an argument you think works, trying to make a space for that. But you're only going to get a hearing if you remain open and honest. So I can tell you that in this week, I'm reviewing book manuscripts for a couple of publishers on very different subjects. One's a 3rd century Roman historian, and a bunch of studies in this book on this historian. And I don't agree with very much of their conclusions or even their approaches in this book, but I can still recommend its publication, because what I see them doing is going about this in a methodological way and exposing their work and showing what they're doing. And you can still learn from that. So no two of us are ever going to agree completely on things. And my work gets published not by people who agree with me in every respect. My book on the war has been quite controversial in some quarters. Okay, that's fine. And then probably even the referees for the press didn't agree with everything, but they still thought, yeah, it's an argument, it's an approach that deserves airing, and we can all learn from it. That's how scholarship works. It's a very different world from the politicized world of the public square in the U.S. and in other countries, where they're basically people defending positions all the time and defending their values. That just doesn't enter into it in scholarship. It does enter into it at the personal level, but we can move beyond it by recognizing the value in others' work, even if we don't agree with it. So that's where I'm at. And I would like to get to those specific challenges at some point. Yeah,
we can definitely jump in right now. some of them are not as closely aligned with the issue of mythicism, so I'm going to start with the one that probably is, and then I'll go on to the others. The earliest arguments about Jesus, we're going to look at two options here, and then I'm going to add a few notes and then pass it back to you for comment. Number one, a historical Jesus existed, but eyewitness testimony was not mentioned by Paul. Disputes about what Jesus said could only be resolved by appeals to visions and scripture. Somehow people agreed about the most basic facts, as if nobody had ever seen or heard Jesus in reality. That is one option. Another option, Jesus was a character invented, purely invented from visions in scripture. Naturally, people disagreed because they each had or claimed to have different visions. Paul explicitly referenced visions in scripture and never mentioned even the possibility of any eyewitness accounts existing. Just a little background, Paul wrote about 20,000 words about Jesus. It's hard to imagine someone writing that many words about someone without making it clear that they were real. All Paul had to do was to mention one place that Jesus had been, one person he had met, one thing he said in person rather than communicated in visions of scripture, one physical action on earth, one family member other than cult brotherhood. The parables of Jesus are strangely absent in Paul. The moral injunctions of Jesus are strangely absent. Paul never calls Jesus a rabbi or a real-life prophet of Israel. There's a whole list of things that Paul should have said, or we would expect to say if Jesus had been real. So with that background in mind, what do you think about those two options? And I know the answer is probably going to be that that's a little too black and white.
You got it in one. That's a perfect example of the point I was trying to make before. There are two options. And if we can throw dust on one, then the other one is the correct one. So the way the two options are presented, however, they make a massive assumption, which you've just elucidated, and that assumption is demonstrably mistaken, I'm afraid. So the assumption is, to restate it in my own words, that Paul's basically the beginner of all this stuff, and Paul relies only on his visions and scripture to put together a tableau. And then you get all this disagreement with Paul, because other people have other visions and other interpretations of scripture. Paul never, according to this assumption, never refers to anything before. He never targets any events in Jesus' life, doesn't talk about it at all. And so he's the starting point. And that's, so the principle of economy, which is a valid principle in historical research, that is, as in science, we favor the simplest explanation, the one with the fewest moving parts that would need also to be supported. We go for the simplest explanation, but simplest explanation of the evidence. So we have to, the first thing we need to do is have a clear picture of the evidence. So let's do that. In 1 Thessalonians, we can pretty much skip that over because that's his very first letter. And what we see there is he's been beaten up and kicked out of places everywhere he goes. Okay, but he does refer briefly in chapter 2, verse 14 to 16, to those who killed the Lord Jesus, the Judeans, the Judaioi in Greek, Jews, Judeans. And he says, because it's an offhand comment, he's really talking about the people in Thessalonica, which he has left. He's gone south down to Corinth, and he says, you all, I think you say that where you are, y'all, that is plural of you, y'all.
Or if you're really good, all y'all.
All y'all. All y'all are suffering the same things from your people, your townspeople, that we suffered from the Judeans. By the way, let me talk about the Judeans. They killed Christ, and they killed the prophets, and they drove us out. And they don't want us doing this stuff, talking to people around the nations. Oh, that's interesting. So that's already his first letter. He refers to an event. And of course, his whole announcement, or evangelion is usually translated gospel. I think it should be translated something like announcement. His announcement to the world is that this guy who died has been raised from the dead. That's the point in 1 Thessalonians 1:10. That's what he says. So that's first letter. Second letter, the second letter that we have, it's not a second letter, because he already refers in 1 Corinthians 5:9 to a previous letter that he wrote, which we don't have. I mean, we think it could be some other letter that we have, but they don't fit the bill. So we have a bunch of lost letters from Paul as well. But the second letter we have, 1 Corinthians, wow, how does it begin? It begins with him saying in 1:10-11, he says, it's been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are all kinds of divisions among you, because after I left, some other folks have come through town and taught you different things. One of them is Peter, Cephas. Cephas, the rock guy, Rocky, of Jesus' students. And he says, and many of you are already following him. Some of you say, I don't belong to Paul anymore. I'm with Cephas. I'm with his group. Well, who's Cephas? Chapter 9 of that letter, he says, and I think around verse 5, he says, when I travel, I don't have a wife, and he makes a virtue of that. In the same letter, he says, the time's too short, the end's coming. Don't get married, which is very non-Jewish. But he said, these other guys who don't do what I do, who don't share my ways, they travel with their wives. Who are they? The brothers of the Lord, and the apostles. And he singles out Cephas as a particular example. Look at him. He takes money from you when he comes. He allows you to support him, and he's traveling in luxury, with his wife. I don't do that. So Paul is referring constantly to, and it gets much, much more intense later. This is only his second letter, to rivalries all around him. Rivalries with whom? With people who were related to Jesus and were Jesus' first students. In chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians, in 23-25, he says, he refers to the night on which Jesus was betrayed. He took bread and broke it and said, this is my body. It's at the Last Supper, the Eucharist in Catholic tradition. It's just an explicit reference. Back in chapter 7, I talked about, he says, don't get married. And he says, well, now this is me talking, it's not Jesus who said this. I'm adding my own restriction that he didn't say. And he acknowledges that. Well, that's amazing as well. And then in chapter 9, he refers to an alleged statement by Jesus that those who live by this, missionizing should live by it. They should be paid for it. And Paul says, I never did that. I could have done it. It was my right to do it, but I didn't do it. I worked night and day, he says in 1 Thessalonians, so that I might not burden any of you with this work. So there's all that. And then there's, of course, the crowning one in 1 Corinthians is chapter 15. He talks about the apostles before him and all these people, and James and the apostles and these other chaps, who were before him. Now it's about the resurrection, of course, and his whole, we could do a whole session on the resurrection. But Paul, the earliest account of the resurrection is he's insisting that it was a spiritual thing. That's not physical, that it's, it was a matter of visions and so on before he came along. So my point is, even just to this point, it's just the second letter we have. There are all kinds of references in Paul to what happened before he came along. Now, when we move on from there to, let's skip over Philippians, Philemon, skip over to Galatians. Galatians, good grief. There he says in Galatians 1, before I came to follow Christ, I used to harass the followers of Christ. That's what I did. I was furious with them. I was trying to Judaize them, re-Judaize them, bring them back to the Torah. And I used to hassle them and make it hard for them until Christ appeared to me and said, stop it, you know. And that there's a much fuller version in Acts, which doesn't really fit with Paul's own account that much, but at least the episode is remembered in a different way in Acts chapter 9, that he was there among the persecutors, even at Stephen's execution. But Paul refers to these previous people quite often. So then he says, then I thought I encountered Christ this way spiritually, but I thought I had better, go to Jerusalem and get this sorted out. But I waited a long time. I visited briefly and saw only Peter and Jesus' brother. I didn't see any of the other apostles. I saw only Peter and Jesus' brother. And then I went back after 14 years and I met the whole bunch of them. But even still, it was a relatively private deal with all these apostles. And he says some really interesting stuff. I don't really care who they were. I mean, they seem to be big shots, right? For me, not so. I don't care. I was called by Christ. Yeah, they have a reputation. Man, they're not so hot. How do you explain all that, right? How do you explain all these personal references, especially when Paul's own communities are getting visits from these people who are saying either, I actually knew Jesus, like this guy is an imposter. How do you explain all that if Paul just invented the whole thing? It's possible. Anything's possible. Almost anything's possible historically. I'm just saying I find it more difficult to explain that way than to say there were all these people and they were actually, it's a real thing. Paul was actually getting on their nerves because of this. Now in 2 Corinthians, I skipped over that. There's another, chapters 11 and 12. This is where he loses it. And he says, I'm losing it, right? He says, I'm beside myself. I'm like a crazy man. And why? Because you all should have stood up for me when these guys came through town. And he goes ballistic and he calls them all kinds of names, among which is hyper-apostle. Like he invents this word, hyper-apostolos. Okay, so they are Hebrews. So am I. Okay, so they are servants of Christ. I'm a better one. I've undergone more beatings and I've been, how do you explain that? There are not two options. There are many options, but the simplest option, it seems to me, is to generate that kind of consistent issue in Paul's career. Is that there were lots of other Christ followers who didn't agree with him and really put him in it. This is equally disconcerting to, the faithful who have a simple view that they've been taught that the apostles were a unified group who just went out doing, Jesus sent them into the four corners of the world. And we see a much more human, a much more vigorous debate. Finally, Romans itself, even though Romans is a very kind of placid, ostensibly placid letter, actually beneath the surface of it is a big deal. Paul's writing to a group that he did not establish in Rome. And he says that, I'm going to bring my announcement to you because you don't have it yet. What? Who? The reason I didn't come to you is I made it a principle not to step on other people's feet, not to go where someone else has planted the seed. I've got my own groups, and that's why I never came to you before. I'm only coming to you now because I have to go to the Western Mediterranean, and you happen to be on the road on the way there. So I would like to stop in and present to you my announcement. Why? Because I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not ashamed of Romans 1:16. I'm not ashamed of my announcement. It's actually what I think will save everybody. You all don't have it yet. You know, so I'm going to bring it. All of these texts point to a prior. And what we have to remember with Paul's letters is these are not essays. I mean, this has been a huge mistake, even of theologians and people who did this stuff, you know, for a living for a long time. They read them as essays, as letters, as complete kind of theological statements. They're not. They're letters. They're one half of a conversation. So they are the perfect case in which a historian says, all right, we have two tasks here. One is to understand what Paul says, actually, try to understand it. And then the other part is to try to explain it by filling in the other half of the conversation. You know, we've all had the experience of overhearing, like maybe we have a partner, a spouse, a good friend, we hear them take a phone call and we hear half of the conversation, right? And then we try to piece together, you know, who's on the other side of this. And if we know them well, we know who their friends and, that's her mother, or, you know, that's his old buddy from, you know, school or whatever, because of the tone and the things they say about, we know, well, we process of elimination, no, it can't be this person or that person. Sometimes we're wrong, or we correct ourselves. We think, oh, it's her mother. Oh no, she wouldn't say that to her mother. That must be her cousin or something, or sister. So we all do that, and that's what history is. It's kind of common sense, applying normal imagination to thinking about the disciplined historical imagination to what makes the best sense of these texts. And so I'm not saying those who think Jesus never existed, it's a ridiculous idea, you're wrong. I don't care what you think, not you, but what other, I don't have time to think of trying to monitor other people's views. Why should I? I don't have any investment in it. Simply, I'm trying to explain a little shaft of light into my world, and why, when I look at these texts, it's easier for me, it's just simpler for me to hypothesize. We have to hypothesize in any case, which hypothesis has the greater explanatory power. So your questioner said there are two options. Paul only ever refers to visions as a criterion and scripture interpretation. I don't think that's true. He never refers to events in Jesus' life. I don't think that's true. Never refers to the stuff that came before. It's not that I think it's a lie. I'm not calling the person a liar. I'm just saying I think it's a mistake. I know these letters fairly well. I've had to write articles and commentaries and things on them. I read them in Greek, and you know, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just trying to say it doesn't work for me. To hypothesize there was no Jesus, he had no family, there was no stake. It's just easier to believe that, not believe in the sense of faith, but just easier to imagine as a hypothesis that, yeah, there was a guy, and then all these people are fighting over his legacy. So
that's good. That's really good. You give me a lot to think about. I definitely would like to do some digging and maybe revisit that in the future for sure, because there was a lot of good points you made there. On the note of First Thessalonians, this other next question was related in this, not related directly, but just because it's First Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 to 17. I'm just going to read it real quick. We don't want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who have already died, so that you will not grieve as the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, God will bring with him those who have already died, who are in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have already died. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, and with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So we shall always be with the Lord. The question on this one is...
That's 17 or 18?
I think that was 13 through 17.
Okay.
I've got it correct. And I translated those who are asleep as those who already died. The question is, this is traditionally referred to as the second coming of Jesus. But a lot of conjecture has come up that this is not referring to the second coming of Jesus, that Paul doesn't know anything about the first coming. So this reference is to Jesus coming for the very first time. Now, I would gather based on what you just said, previous to this, to my reading this verse, that no, Paul did see this as a second coming that he was referring to. How do you see that passage and anything like it in the New Testament that seems to refer to a coming back of Jesus? Is he coming back, or is he coming for the first time?
Yeah. Well, I mean, here again, we just need, our first task is to understand what's in the text, right? So I confess to you, I didn't really understand that question when you forwarded it to me. That the questioner or challenger said, there's no idea of a first coming here, right?
Mm-hmm.
As you just said now. Okay, I just don't understand it. I don't. We need to communicate, and I don't understand what the point is. So let me read to you.
Sure.
1 Thessalonians Chapter 1, verse 9. The people of these regions report about us what kind of welcome we had among you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven. Okay, who's this Son? Chapter verse 10. Whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who rescues us from the wrath that is coming. It seems to me pretty clear that Paul is saying there, God raised this Jesus from the dead, and that's the Jesus who's, well, that's what he says. I mean, who's rescuing us from the wrath that is coming. And the passage I recalled for you before is from chapter 2, where he accuses the Jews of having killed Jesus. So when he talks about Jesus coming back, he explicitly says it's the Jesus who was killed, who is also now going to return. I'm not sure I ever used the term second coming. I may have done. If I did, it was only to relate to what I thought your viewers might know. It's not a term I have any stake in, and I would generally avoid it, because in my mind, I associate it with TV preachers and all kinds of stuff like that. I try to stay as close to Paul's language as possible. Mm-hmm. So I would talk about like the return of Christ. That's what it is, in his language. Well, he's just saying we're waiting for Jesus. What to do in the meantime? Live blamelessly. Live, especially with respect to sexuality. Porneia, he calls it, sexual sin, you might say, but, just basically don't, he says, each one of you has to know how to maintain your vessel in purity. It's often just translated your body or something like that, but I think he means it's a vivid term for like your sex organ, keep it in your robes, like while you're waiting for Christ to return. Because, obviously, I think it was Celsus already, of the Greco-Roman philosophers, who looked at Christians and said, this is a very silly idea. There's a place for humans on the earth. There's a place for fish in the water. There's a place for birds in the air. People do not go in the air. That's not going to happen. And Paul seems to be somewhat sensitive to the issue, and therefore thinks that, we've got to somehow become spirit to make this transformation. And he will spell that out in 1 Corinthians 15, that in order to make the transition, those who have died are going to be raised as spirits anyway. Those of us who are still alive, in Paul's language, those of us who are still living, so he expects this to happen very soon, are going to be transformed in an instant, in the twinkling of an eye. Our physical bodies must become something else, spirit, because only spirit can go into clouds. Again, this is not traditional Christian thinking, that the resurrection must be physical. Paul's really against this idea in 1 Corinthians 15. Anyhow, I think that relates to what's going on here. But whatever he exactly thought about the risen Jesus, it seems to me, either he changed his mind as he went along, that he sort of just hadn't thought about it too much and assumed it was physical. And then once he got in a corner, began to say, oh, wait, actually, it must be spiritual. Or he always thought it was spiritual, just never bothered telling anybody. In any case, the link between the Jesus who died and the one who rose is pretty clear. In 1 Corinthians 15, he spells this out absolutely clearly, that he died and was buried. And then, but then what you uses this analogy, what you sow in the ground, when you put seeds in the ground, and then when the harvest comes and you see like fruit and ears of corn or grain or whatever, it's not like the seed you put in. It's a completely different thing. So he analogizes death to, what goes into the ground. It's a very clever analogy in a way to what comes up, but it's completely different. So that takes away the idea that you have in Luke, the idea that it's just like a guy who he died, was buried, and the same guy, even though he's not detectable because the disciples are dumb, but they don't recognize him. But it's the same guy. It is a human being, just looks like the same guy. That's not Paul's idea at all. He became a life-giving spirit in 1 Corinthians 15. But to answer the question, so I don't get too far away from it, if we're talking about Paul's idea is certainly that the Jesus who died was raised up and is coming back, whatever you want to call that.
Gotcha. So it would be, in a sense, about a second coming there in 1 Thessalonians 4.
Yeah, if you want to use that language, yeah.
Gotcha. That's good. I appreciate that. I feel like I've got some clarifications I need to dig into, and maybe if I have anything to follow up on that, I'll definitely bring that in the next one. I did want to move a little bit away from mythicism to stuff that's, I guess, related to it, but some of the other questions that we talked about offline. The narrative about James saying he knew his brother better than Paul, are we seeing that correctly? And then, as somewhat related, I think, in Antiquities 2200, Joseph refers to a James. Is that James the brother of Jesus, or James the brother of the high priest Jesus ben Damnius?
Yeah. Well, first things first. I saw the way the challenge came was that I talked last time about how plausible James would be to Paul's groups. So Paul's teaching them, okay, Jesus died, rose, is coming back. That's all you need to know. Wait for him. And then James comes along, and men from James come along, and they say, no, wait a minute, James says, I'm his brother, okay? I knew him. You can trust me, don't trust Paul. And I think the challenger was saying, where's that? We're like, you're telling us this. I think he even called it a lie, saying it's not in the narrative. Well, I think there's just a big misunderstanding. I never said it was in a narrative. I never said, well, let's begin. Paul didn't write narratives, right? So there's no narrative for it to be in. Paul wrote letters, and a letter is a half of a conversation. So what I was doing, and I do remember this fairly explicitly, I was trying to bring common human existence and experience into light as a way of understanding this. So what we do know is this. That is what we do know from the texts. What we do know that the texts say is this, that this James, the brother of Jesus guy, who turns up in the Gospels, in Acts, and in Paul's letters, is a mysterious character in a certain way. Because in the Gospels, he's emphatically not one of Jesus' followers or students. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, 19 to 21, there's a passage in there that is not picked up in any of the other Gospels, either Matthew or Luke, even though common view is, which I share, that Matthew and Luke are dependent on Mark. And they take over, between them, they take over virtually all of Mark. This little passage is not, because in this little passage, Jesus' family go to arrest him because they think he's crazy. Now, that is a problem for both Matthew and Luke, because both Matthew and Luke have infancy narratives in which Jesus' mother has, or father has angelic experiences and knows perfectly well who Jesus is. So that little episode does not fit, and they just quietly drop it out. But in Mark, it's clear that the mother and the brothers and the family, they're spelled out in Mark chapter 6, and James is among them. James is emphatically not among Jesus' students, nor is he even in Luke, who develops the whole apostle thing. Like when Judas betrays him, that we need a replacement because you got to have 12, and there's the whole story about replacing the apostles. James is still not, he doesn't qualify. He's not an apostle, but he turns up suddenly leading the church. He's like leading the community in Acts. In Acts chapter 15, James is in charge. In Acts chapter 21, James is the guy that Paul has to go and report to. And James is saying, look, all the Jews, I mean, even the Jews who believe in Christ, really don't like you. I mean, they've heard about you, that you badmouth Moses and the Torah and tell Jews not to circumcise their children and all this stuff. We got to do something here, buddy, whether you like it or not. I got a plan here. You're gonna pay for some vows. You're gonna go in the temple. You're gonna show everybody you observe the Torah. Paul doesn't observe the Torah. That's quite clear from his letters. But in Acts, that's the situation. And James is the guy in charge. How did he get to be in charge? In Paul's letters, it's the same thing. He names James, the brother of Jesus, as the kind of head honcho. And it was when men came from James into Antioch, and Peter was eating with non-Jews. He saw men from James, and he said, well, barfs up his food and puts it in his napkin and says, I wasn't eating with them. And Paul says, you hypocrite, you were doing this. You had no problem with it. You believed what I believe. But then the men from James came and you got all scared. And then he accuses him directly, second person singular in Greek. Why do you compel Gentiles to live as Jews when you realize the truth of the matter? They don't have to become Jews. And then in chapter 6, what I was talking about last time, he uses very similar language. It's only those who are afraid of being persecuted themselves who are taking heat, who want to, they don't really care in their hearts. They don't really care. They want you to be circumcised and follow the Torah for their own protection. Then I put that together with, so these are the texts we have in the early Christian text. Antiquities of Josephus, book 20, 197 to 203. He's talking about this high priest Ananus II, Ananus, son of Ananus, who was a very eminent high priest. And strangely, the really strange thing in that passage is that he really likes Ananus in his earlier work, The War. Ananus, for him, he's the guy who led the Jews through the war against Rome. He was executed by the more radical elements in Jerusalem, but he really praises him twice and repeatedly, gives him a eulogy as like one of the noblest people who, and Josephus was emulating him in some way. But in Antiquities 20, right from 197 onward, he presents him in a rather bad light as not such as a rather violent man. He says there he was a Sadducee, and the Sadducees.
Referring to James here or Amnias?
I'm referring to Ananus,
Ananus,
the high priest.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to contextualize the James thing there. So he says that, when there was no governor, sub-governor, equestrian governor in town in Caesarea, the one died in post and was waiting for a replacement in around probably 62 CE. He was a Sadducee, and he did some savage things because that's what Sadducees do. He's already told us that back in 13, that the Sadducees are rather severe in their punishments, and they want execution for a guy who dissed John Hyrcanus, whereas the Pharisees are naturally lenient in their punishments and who didn't want the death penalty. So he brings that up again here to say that Ananus, being a savage guy and having these enemies, people he accused of breaking the law, which were not only James, he just picks out James as, this is typical of Josephus, he picks out one among many. He does that all through. And he says, like, there were many pseudo-prophets at the time. There were many misleaders of the people. Let me tell you about one of them. He was named like this. It's a typical kind of trait of his. And he says, so Ananus got rid of a bunch of people on the claim that they were breaking the law. So he's a Sadducee, he's a very harsh line. And then among them was this brother of the one known as Christos, Jesus, who was called James. What I simply think that the passage doesn't present any problems. I mean, he's already referred to somehow, and we'll talk about the testimony of Flavianum sometime. If we take the simplest, most economical view, we have a text, and he mentioned Jesus somehow. It's been retouched, it's been doctored by Christian scribes, but I have good reason to think the simplest explanation is that Josephus wrote something about Jesus and said he was known as the Christ, and he's simply referring back to that. The reason I'm going to single out this guy for you is just recently, in 18, I mentioned that, you remember that guy I told you about, this is his brother. Because these names are very common. Yaakov, we call him James in English, but his Hebrew name is Yaakov and Greek name Jacobus. That's a really common name, and so is Jesus. I think there's something like 34 or 35 Jesus is just mentioned in Josephus. So he has to give a qualification. Which one am I talking? There's a Jesus, the high priest, not the one you're talking about, but a different Jesus. So there's not Damnias, but Jesus Gamalas, who was killed also alongside Ananus at the time of the war. So he has to say who he means, and he's saying, so he introduces it not by saying James, but by saying, or Yaakov, but by saying the brother of the so-called Christos guy, Jesus, his brother James, he was one of those that Ananus killed. I don't know. I mean, anything can be interpolated, anything at all. You could argue for every single paragraph in Josephus' 30 volumes being an interpolation, but you have to. It's like in back in when we did math in school. I don't know, at least when I was in school, Stone Age, teachers made, it wasn't enough to get the right number, right, the right answer. You had to show your work,
right?
They said, right, because you might have cheated, or you might have guessed, been lucky and got the number, and you might get like 1 point for that. But what they really want to see is how you got to that point. So the conclusion itself, it doesn't matter to me that much. I mean, if it's invented, Josephus says full of mysteries. I mean, mysteries not in the capital M sense, but in the sense of puzzles. There are all kinds of people who show up and disappear in his narratives, but you have to get used to the way Josephus writes. For me, I'm just saying for me, I'm not telling anybody else what to think. For me, who works on Josephus every day, that at least I'm not just a wingnut here. I mean, I have some familiarity with, I write a detailed commentary on Josephus' works, line by line, word by word, looking up his other uses of the term. I have some familiarity with the way he does things. for me, doesn't present any problems. For me, trying to posit an unknown figure here, well, first of all, why is there a problem? It's only a problem if it becomes a problem if you've already wiped out the Testimony Flavianum, that the entire 1863-64. If that wasn't even there, then this passage would be a problem. Why did Josephus refer to that? But the passage is there in 18. It's in all the texts. So for me, it doesn't present any problems. And the effort to think of another way of explaining it by changing the connections, not the brother of Christ, but the brother of somebody else, an unknown brother of somebody else. It's creating problems that I don't have because I already think that something was there in 18. So it's just simpler. And simplicity is an operative principle in history. Go for the simplest explanation. It's simpler to think that's what's there. Similarly, by the way, with the John the Baptist passage, the same, strangely enough, because that doesn't even mention Jesus at all. But in 18, 116 to 119, he talks about John the Baptist, a very famous passage. And some people want to argue that that's an interpolation. In fact, one well-known blogger went after me on this, saying Josephus could not possibly have written this passage. Actually, he could possibly have written it, and I think he did. And the reason I think he did is not pulling this out of my ass or out of the air, is that when you read it, it's full of his characteristic language. I mean, not just general Greek language, but his characteristic language. For example, just to give you an idea of what I have in my head here when I'm making these decisions, there's a word for sin. You've been to Bible college, you've probably come across this word. That's very common. Sin in classical Greek, it means falling short or missing the mark or something like that. Hamartia. Hamartia is the Greek word. It's very common. It's ubiquitous in Greek literature, but most of it doesn't mean sin in Paul's sense. It means just like a failure, falling short, shortcoming, something like that. But for Paul, it's like capital rough breathing mark, capital H. It's like sin. And he even personalizes it. Sin had me trapped, things like that in Romans 7. Well, that's Christian. That's Christian language. Take this clearly the default Christian term. There's another term that's not very common at all in ancient writers. It's another form of the same word, hamartas. Hamartas instead of hamartia. Josephus, as it happens, uses this word. I think it's an Ionic word in origin. That is a dialect of Greek. Josephus prefers this word, or he uses it quite often in the Antiquities, all the way through the Antiquities. And he uses it in the John the Baptist passage. So when John the Baptist says that, that your sins should not be covered by the washing, you have to already repent first. That's the word he uses, hamartas. He says that John taught Eusebia of piety toward God and justice towards one's fellows. This is classic Josephus. It's the pair that he uses to judge all the kings of Israel in Antiquities. It's his classic thing. When he talks about the Essenes, he said the first two oaths they swear are to practice piety toward God, justice toward their fellows. It's classic Josephus language. And it's not Christian. I mean, the Christian idea is indeed that washing, baptism is a thing, that is what you have to do it because it washes away sin. And that's also the standard, Jewish immersion. You actually have to, the water is important. It does a thing. So when Josephus presents John the Baptist as reacting against that and saying that, that's the typical view, but that's not what John was doing. He said you actually have to practice, piety and justice first. This is classic Josephus language. So what I'm trying to say is, it's very easy for somebody who doesn't do my job to say, that's weird. That how can you believe that? I can see right away these parallels over here. Josephus could not have said that. Okay, fine. I have no problem with you, not you, but the person who says such things. Namaste. I wish you wholeness, wealth, and prosperity. I really have absolutely no reason to be concerned about what you think, except that more power to you. Go for it. Enjoy your life. But don't tell me, please don't tell me what makes sense to me, what should make sense to me. You're not living my life. You're not doing my job. That's what I'm trying to get at, Tim. It's not a competition here. I really wish everyone happiness in their own work, but I can only tell you or try to give you some reasons why when I say it doesn't work for me, that's what I mean.
Yeah, and a lot of that does come down to just, the mutual respect for people to land different places. And I think it's really critical. And my discussions with you have always been a good reminder that when you see someone who has studied, either in general or a specific topic, a lot more than you, it's time to listen. Even if you feel like you've got some objections, you've got some points you want to make, it's like there's a time to, like if you're to go back to the karate example, if you're fighting next to someone who's got the same belt as you deal with that spar differently than you would with someone who's 7 belts above you. And there's definitely a respect that needs to happen, and just a respect of people can agree to disagree without it having to be, you're a bad guy.
An experience I learned the hard way. I have indentations on my shin from my sensei, who, when I got over my station and tried to hit him hard, he let me know that he was humoring me in sparring with me, and I should not get above that. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also a great inspiration too for those of us who are more on the outside looking in to say, hey, there are resources to start to dig in and get educated. And I may never be I'm sure I'll never be a PhD, pretty sure, but I can still get educated and begin to at least understand the discussions as opposed to just leaving them for the professionals. I know
can you remind me of the last question though? Because I know I got off a little bit on the tangent there using other comparisons, but
the James question?
The last one you asked about
the very last one about James.
But it was still about First Thessalonians, right?
No, I had moved on from that one. That was about the second coming of Jesus.
After that. So. James. So why did I say yes? I just want to make that perfectly clear. I was not claiming that there was a narrative that said this.
Okay.
What I was trying to say was, okay, this is something we need to fill in. Now imagine that there is a brother who says, I was his brother, I know the guy. So we know that he was there. The texts make that clear. But the little bit I was trying to fill in was, why would he be so appealing? And I was trying to say, from human experience, we know I have a brother, and he's my closest friend in the world. And if I died before him, I think it's entirely likely he's younger than I am. I could easily imagine if somebody tries to say this is what Mason was about or did, I could easily imagine my brother saying, wait a minute, that wasn't him. I hope he would stick up for me. Something like that. That's what I was saying. I was not trying to say there was a narrative that said something.
Gotcha. And just a follow-up question before I ask the last main question. James referred there is in Antiquities 20 is not James the brother of the high priest Jesus ben Damnius, in your opinion?
Well, it's not my opinion. I mean, that's the text does not say that at all. It says he's the brother of the guy who was known as Christos, that Jesus guy known as Christos. That's what the text says.
Okay, perfect.
The only reason that becomes a problem is if you think the Antiquities 18 passage was not there.
Right. And I definitely want to dive into that with you in the future.
Yeah, another time. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to see, do you have time for one or two more final questions?
Just checking the clock here. Yes, actually.
Okay, I'll try to keep these.
because our time went back, actually, it's earlier than I would have anticipated.
That's true. That's true. Well, we can keep these moving too quickly just for the sake of time. But you had argued, I believe, before in your book Josephus and the New Testament, that Luke knew of Josephus's Jewish War, which was circa 79 CE, and Jewish Antiquities, circa 94 CE.
Yeah.
Could you, and I'm going to give a couple of notes here, could you talk about Luke's use of Josephus and perhaps touching a little bit on the continued academic resistance to the idea that Luke used the Antiquities of the Jews as a source? The books of Luke and Acts do appear to have parallels to the works of Josephus, where it appears that Luke may be copying stories from Josephus that have nothing to do with Jesus and using them as he tells stories about Jesus. And number one, is that correct? If that's correct, the question arises, obviously, who copied whom? Luke and Acts do appear to be building their stories based on Josephus's perspectives on and support of Judaism. So does it appear that Luke is pulling from Josephus, as he references Mark, to create his stories? And then if any of that is correct, number one, if I'm accurately describing it, and you would agree with some of that, what does that do to the historicity of the stories in Luke, like the Nativity? In other words, is Luke fabricating any of this history? And then a very quick follow-up to that at the end, does that help us determine the date range for when Luke and Acts were created? In other words, if Luke is referencing the Jewish War, then it was no later than 79. And if he was referencing the Jewish Antiquities, then it was no earlier than 94 AD and possibly later. So two different questions, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'll try to be as concise as I can. I have a strong tendency, as you have witnessed, to try to contextualize everything in big context. So let me try to keep this as focused and simple as I can.
Sure.
Your viewers, if they're still watching this, have enormous patience. So I want to get right to it. First, two things. First thing is, it hasn't been unanimous scholarly resistance by any means. So I need to make that clear. Scholarship falls in all kinds of different camps. And there are a number of groups among scholars whose work is not on Josephus, who focus on understanding Luke Acts. So in the Society of Biblical Literature, there are groups devoted to Luke Acts. They've invited me to go and talk with them. And one scholar who passed away, Richard Purvo, made a big deal of my arguments. He gave me full credit for them and used that as a springboard for his own picture of Acts, especially not Luke so much, Acts as basically a fiction, historical fiction, but fiction mainly. Other people have pushed back against that and found other things, to qualify that. But his main argument was it's very late. And so there's a whole bunch of scholars now who would date Acts very late. I mean, even later than I would have guessed. I would have guessed early 2nd century on this basis. And some of them will push it to 140, 150. Some of them even see it as a reaction to Marcion. So Marcion in Rome, 140, 140s, and Acts as a response to Marcion in its kind of emphases. That's an interesting argument. Again, in all of these areas, I don't need to believe anything. I just read the arguments, say, that's interesting. I don't particularly find that compelling, but it's not a bad argument. I see why they make it. I just don't think it's strong enough to pass the bar of, being totally convincing. But that's fine. Because main thing in history is not to, conclusions come and go. They don't really matter that much. It's about the work, the method, the investigation. So that's the first thing. There's a bunch of scholars actually have built on and support this idea and have used my work in this respect as a foundation and said, we like his argument, we find that convincing, and now we're going to build on that. There are other scholars, of course, who don't like it, and they mostly ignore it. They just mostly, that's amazing. If they know it at all. And I think the main reason is they tend to be more conservative, and they very much want Luke and Acts to be, some of them will date Acts because it ends before Paul's death. Some of them see that as a criterion for dating the work before Paul's death, even so in the 60s already. I think this is just really difficult on a number of grounds. But again, more power to them if that floats their boat. That's fine with me. Now, second is the why, and the direction of dependence. If there's dependence, why do I think that? Well, here I need to be very clear that I'm using the standard criteria. As a professor, when I get two papers from students, that I have to be very careful about this. But if I see sentences and terminology that are the same, there are basically, the assumption is that no two people, given the vastness of possibilities of language, no two people will write the same. If you ask someone, how are you doing today? And the person says, well, as I strolled out of my door this morning, I took in the azure sky and I was, elevated in my spirit. Okay, and then you ask someone else and they say the same thing, or even use a few of the same words, the azure sky and elevated in my spirit, something like that. You say, wait a minute, like this is not possible. It's possible in the sense that the infinite monkey hypothesis, producing Shakespeare, like it's somehow logically possible in an infinite universe of infinite possibilities, of infinite monkeys, but it's not really possible. In practical terms, it's not possible. So we assume a dependence of some kind. Either A borrowed from B, or B borrowed from A, or A and B borrowed from C, a common source. But there has to be some literary relationship. So that's the criterion. I didn't invent it. It's just common sense. Because there are no other possibilities here in this case. Now, there are a multitude of possibilities in defining then what C might have been. So C could be oral tradition, it could be written tradition, it could be composite, so there are many, many possibilities, but this basic framework or if A and B were contemporaries, they might also have collaborated. That's another possibility. So, but if we're assuming, if we know they're independent, if we can rely on independence, either A got it from B, B got it from an A, or common source. Now, the common view is that Lukács and Josephus have some shared stuff because they got it from a common source. And that common source may not be literary. Conservatives would say, well, because it happened, like the common source is the events, and they're both looking at them, and Josephus is therefore confirming Lukács. He's an external witness to the truth of Lukács because he's reporting the same events. What events? Well, to run through them briefly, the census under Quirinius, which required major taxation. This is not in Matthew. It contradicts Matthew's story of Jesus' birth completely, but it's in Luke. It's very awkward for Luke because the census took place in 6 CE when Quirinius became legatus of Syria. Whereas Luke also puts Jesus' birth before the death of Herod. And Matthew makes a big deal of that, that Jesus was born before Herod died, but Herod died in 4 BCE, 10 years before the census. So the two stories don't align. Anyway, that's first thing, the census under Quirinius. And it's a big deal because it's referred to again in Acts chapter 5 by Gamaliel. The Pharisee refers to the census under Quirinius as the time when Judas the Galilean was active. Again, so now not only the census, but Judas the Galilean. Not only that, but as you go on, you find out that the Pharisees in Acts are called a hieresis in Greek. That is a philosophical school. Not only that, they are the most precise of the philosophical schools, the acribistate. And that is when Paul says in, I think, Acts 23 says, I was educated in the most precise of the schools among us, the Pharisees. Okay. So then the Pharisees and the Sadducees also are two hiereses, two schools of philosophy in Acts. Then Acts mentions a guy named the Egyptian. and it mentions a group called Sicarii. And the Tribune says to Paul, oh, you're speaking Greek to me, you know Greek. So you're not, like it's a totally bizarre statement. So you're not then the Egyptian who led all these Sicarii out into the desert. This is the author showing off his knowledge. Like this is an unreal conversation, right? The Tribune's not going to say to Paul, oh, so you're not this guy from the works of Josephus that I'm thinking of. That doesn't make any sense. And there are a number of things like that, right? And also the conflict between Pharisees and Sadducees in the whole nature of the beast. So in Luke Acts, Jesus is a friend of Pharisees, or at least they keep inviting him to dinner, even though he tells them off for being hypocrites. They keep inviting him back 3 times, only in Luke Acts, because the Pharisees are among the common people, and they are not Jesus' enemies. They are the ones in Luke 13 who tell him to go and flee from Herod Antipas because he's in danger. And they accompany him to Jerusalem. They call him teacher. The last you see of them in Luke is when everybody's doing the Hosanna outside of Jerusalem, the triumphal entry, and the Pharisees are indignant and say, teacher, tell your students to knock it off. You know, like this is too much. And Jesus says, let it be. And that's the end of it. They're no longer involved. Whereas in Mark, it's the Pharisees and the Herodians who conspire to kill Jesus from Mark 3:6 onward. The Pharisees who counsel with the Herodians about how they could do him in. And they're already his mortal enemies from the beginning. Same in the Gospel of John. And in Matthew, it's postponed somewhat, but they become his enemies. And they're all involved in the trial. They're all still around. They're like this unified Jewish opposition to Jesus. Luke Acts is not like that. Luke Acts makes a big distinction, fascinating distinction between the Pharisees who operate among the common people and the Sadducees, who are the real bad guys. The Sadducees, who in Mark, they're just like one-trick pony. They only show up waving signs around saying, no resurrection, there's no resurrection. That's their only role in the story. We're the people who believe in no resurrection. But in Luke Acts, they are the power base. They are the mean guys. And just like Josephus said, the Sadducees are the savage ones. Who are, remember, I mentioned before, they're the ones savaging punishment. In Luke Acts, they are the ones who come out. The high priest is said to be a Sadducee in Acts 3. And it's the Sadducees who really want to punish the apostles, right? They want to kill them. They want to imprison them, torture them, kill them. It's a Pharisee, then the Pharisees reappear in the person of Gamaliel, who sticks up for them and says, leave them alone. We don't know, is the thing from God? Maybe it will be. Let it be. God will take care of it. And then in Acts 15, it's a bunch of Pharisees who believe in Christ and come following him. So the tables are turned. And where does that come from? This idea that the Pharisees are very popular among the people and they are Jesus kind of, hood. Whereas the Sadducees are the stone cold, vicious, wealthy, elite murderers in the temple. That happens to fit with Josephus. Now, what I wanted to say is, these things are not things that are just floating around out there for anybody to grab. They are Josephus's distinctive language. The idea of making Pharisees, Sadducees into haereses, philosophical schools, and to say that the Pharisees are the most precise, accurate or reputed to be the most precise or accurate of the philosophical schools, that's Josephus to a T. So the point is that if you see the distinctive language of one author turn up in another author, you can be pretty sure that, B got it from A. It's not a question of Josephus getting it from Luke Acts. That would be absurd because Luke Acts screws everything up. Also, the Sicarii, it's not agreed upon, but I have argued that the Sicarii are a literary creation of Josephus. That is, there was no group in Judea that went around by the Latin name Sicarii. I think that's bizarre. But Josephus is writing in Rome, and the Sicarii were very well known as it's one of the crimes you can be executed for in Rome, is being a knife assassin, carrying a concealed weapon, concealed knife under your cloak, stabbing people, sticking it back under your cloak and walking away. This was viewed on the same level as poisoning, as a secret way of murdering people. And if you are accused of that, if you're convicted of it, you're executed. So Josephus is using this term Sicarii, not because they were called Sicarii in Judea, but because he's communicating with a Roman audience. But he's the only guy who uses Sicarii, Sicarioi in Greek, uses this Latin loanword, and he uses it quite often. It's his characteristic way of writing, and he doesn't have a specific group of people in mind. He's also the only guy who mentions the Egyptian, right? And it only works in Josephus because, like, this guy, the Egyptian, his parents didn't call him the Egyptian, right? When he was born, that's not his name. He had a name, right? But he comes to Jerusalem, and lots of Egyptians come to Jerusalem. Egyptian Jews come to Jerusalem for the festivals, and he starts to lead a bunch of people in promising to attack the auxiliary fortress in Jerusalem. Josephus has a reason to call him the Egyptian because he's simply distinguishing him from all the other troublemakers. He says there was one guy, an Egyptian guy, and then in a subsequent reference, well, the Egyptian did this. He can call him the Egyptian because he already introduced him as an Egyptian. So it makes sense in his narrative that he distinguished him as an Egyptian. It makes no sense for an independent source to call him the Egyptian because the guy had a name. You should call him whatever his name was, from Egypt, like Bob from Egypt. But just to call him the Egyptian doesn't make any sense because there were thousands of Egyptians who came. It's like calling somebody in Britain, say, the American. Well, what do you there's tens of thousands of Americans living in London. So what do you mean, the American? He has a name, right? So this is very odd. And when you add up all these oddities that he fastens on the Quirinius census, he's mentioning, if you were an independent writer and there were all these interesting people in the population, you would pick out different ones. But he picks out the same ones that Josephus picks out, right? And he describes them in the same language as Josephus uses. Dan, I think you have a very strong case, not a perfect case. We don't know, we weren't there, but we have to interpret the evidence, and that's a pretty strong case that Lukács, the author of Lukács, mangled up. He didn't sit down and copy because he got some things, like the Egyptian and the Sicarii are two different people, but it's the very fact that he threw these two together in the Tribune's comment to Paul, which is a very kind of fake learned argument that, I know about the Egyptian, I know about the Sicarii. Because this author of Lukács is always kind of showing off, as just not a criticism, everybody did, dropping names and letting people, I know what the correct terminology is for these things. Like in the whole Acts 27 story, he's using all these terms for sailing, boats and ropes and anchors and whatnot. He knows all the lingo for that. So I think that's how he is as an author. He's to his credit, he's not just using vague, we got in a boat and sailed to this place. He's being very vivid in his precise descriptions. So I think he likes to use this language. Where does he get it from? I think the obvious source is Josephus, because that's his language, actually. That's my argument in a nutshell. Yeah. Oh, I've lost you. Can you hear me?
Sorry, yeah, I was on mute. I love the insights. I love how that stuff that's the kind of stuff that brings the passages to life. Obviously, when I was, a Christian, you'd hear some of that kind of stuff from a Christian perspective of, oh, this word in Greek means this, and so you think, oh, I understand it better. But you're
Yeah.
really, this is like going down to the metadata. Like let's really understand the context, and that helps tremendously. I feel like every time I learn something like that, I get the clear indication that there's, for every one of those that you elucidate, there's probably another 100 that that I have yet to learn. So it's a good inspiration to to keep digging, and obviously your books do a lot of good work on that. Could I end with a completely different kind of question?
Okay.
If you're okay with it.
We'll see.
We've talked a lot about mythicism. We talked a lot about Josephus, a bit here, Luke and Acts. And it's all very important. But one of the big questions that all of it relates to is obviously, well, what do you believe? Like not what do you study, but what do you personally believe? And obviously we have both gone down paths that are, I think, pretty similar. And in the sense that we both deconverted from Christianity. So I do want to ask a question that's more directly related to that. And this is more just for my getting to know you. And this will be the last question. Do you think that there is any part of us that continues to exist after we die?
Oh.
Real light, easy question for the final one. Do we have a soul of any sorts? Are we literally just animated, very amazing animated stardust, so to speak, but at the end of it, we do turn back into worm food and there is nothing that goes forward?
I tend to see these discussions, because they're framed in Western terms, as either believing sort of some part of the Christian story or not. So it's like Socrates said, basically, in Plato said of Socrates in the Apology, and Marcus Aurelius comes back to this again in his Meditations. It's either atoms, like total dispersal, or there's something, there's some continuing life. And both of them basically said, I don't know. Yeah. So either way, it's okay. And Marcus uses this to say, don't worry, either one's not bad. Either you're not going to know anything anyway, so don't worry about it. Or you have a nice afterlife. But even these options are, very much Western options. I think there are different ways of thinking about all this that explode the two option kind of choice. And let me just briefly try to say, because I'm not in no way expert on what I'm about to say. You asked me the question, Tim, so you're stuck with the response that this is not my area of experience and competence at all. But since my undergraduate years, I've been very privileged to have studied somewhat in translation, Hindu, Indian, and Chinese texts, talking about the Brahman, the kind of the universal spirit, that sort of thing, in Hindu side, the Tao, and the Chinese side, and they're not the same, but they both have some sense of the like the ultimate energy of the universe. If you try to take into account modern physics as well, on a popular level, but very smart, I think, is Deepak Chopra, is a guy who, for example, among others, but he does it in a very interesting way. He tries to unite Hindu thinking, Hindu philosophy, with modern physics. And people criticize him as well, of course, as being a dilettante or something. But still, I think he has some nice ideas about, and especially about these questions, about a way that modern Westerners can think about these ancient traditions that are not Western and integrate them. So, I mean, basically, just thinking about modern physics, the idea, and again, absolutely no competence in these areas, but just as a human being who's interested. The idea of our lives as being like the matter that we have, which is really energy, it's like constantly changing. That the permanence of ourselves is already an illusion, right? Because our cells are constantly replacing each other, just constantly. Every few years, we're totally new people, even though we look kind of the same, because there's something that continues in the energy mapping, So for me, to answer your question, I don't think that there's, I don't see the appeal of the idea that as an individual, I continue to exist. I just don't. I don't see how that would work. Where would I exist? But, and it's no small thing. I didn't exist before either as an individual. So, I mean, it's all a process, right? I mean, my life is a little blip of a process in the reformation of energy. It's like an energy soup that we exist in, and we are part of that energy. And as long as we hold together, we are a kind of localized field of that energy. But it's always in a process of transition. It's not like, and the problem is, from the Western point of view, is that we have this idea of essences, right? As we now exist, we are a thing. We're a person. We're a whole. We're real, and therefore, what happens to us? Well, there's a different way of looking at it. That we weren't, and all of this kind of just these fluctuations of energy that produced us for this time, and we have this coherence, and it's a wonderful thing. We love and we live and we have knowledge, and we reason together, and that's a beautiful thing. But then it constantly changes, and then we pass out of that, but the energy continues. So Joseph Campbell is another interesting guy. I don't know if you ever came across him.
I don't think so.
But he, I remember listening to a lecture of his when he came to McMaster many years ago. And, it's a nice way of talking about death. Is he pointed to like the lights, with awful lights in the ceiling. I guess there are lots and lots of lights. The simple point he made was the light doesn't go out. In other words, the energy doesn't stop. A light can go out, but it's just the light continues, and so what we really are, in a sense, the energy we are continues. So that's why I was hesitant about just answering your question as yes or no, because I think there are beautiful ways of thinking about this, that are not depressing and not terrible. But they only become terrible if we're clinging to an illusion, in a sense, of our permanence.
Yeah. Do you think that there'll be any awareness of that continuing energy, or do you think that will be more of a
German expression is kind of Ahnung. I have absolutely no clue.
It's a fascinating subject for me, because I know I told you before in our last chat, one of the gentlemen that I like to listen to a lot, the YouTube channel named Pine Creek Doug. He does a lot of epistemology, but he will say something like, I really don't want to live forever.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's other people that would agree with him, but I'm the complete opposite. If you told me that there was a way, that this was actually, not that I'd want Christianity to be true. I know it's not. I'm not sure I'd want it to be, with the blood magic and all the scapegoating and all that crazy stuff. But just if there was a way to say you can live forever.
Yeah.
Every part of me through and through would say, absolutely, I want to live forever. So it's an interesting topic to me, as an aside, to all the mythicism and so forth, just as an atheist, to say, I would rather know the truth, to say, no, you're not going to live forever, embrace the truth, and live your life accordingly. I'd rather live a well-examined life in that sense. But and I was speaking with another gentleman recently, a guy in the UK, who was talking about the example of the Matrix, where one of the gentlemen, one of the characters in there, a gentleman who wanted to get plugged back into the Matrix and never know that he'd ever escaped. He just wanted to be plugged in, get back to real life, and just think of himself as, he's a rich man living a nice life, and he lives his full life and he dies and he never knows that it's not real.
Yeah.
And this gentleman in the UK was saying, no, I think I'd be tempted to say I'd be open to being plugged in, because if you're like, okay, if your one reality is you have a good chance of getting cancer and dying, a good decent chance that one of your kids will die before you, a good chance you might get maimed, blah blah blah. Those are horrible things. If you could, and then you die, and then it's over, and there's nothing good. Well, if you could instead just have a nice happy life, or in this case, you would know at least that there's a nice happy afterlife as a Christian or some kind of religion. That wouldn't you want that? And I was very torn. He was saying, no, I think I'd plug back in. I was saying, I think I'm more the well-examined life person. I'd rather live a sad, or not sad, but hard life with the truth than a super happy life that's completely false. But it's an interesting question, and I'm sure you would answer by saying those are two different options. There's an option in the middle.
There are many. I think there are many options in the middle. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a definitely.
There's a way to be joyful, I think, and hope. Part of it is letting the ego go, that the individuality go, and realize that, of course, we have an ego. That's what holds us together. But also at the same time, to realize it's only one side of the story, that we are also, these functions of energy. And that's a beautiful thing, actually. It can be good for our healing, for our relationships, for our view of others. If we understand that these are not enemies, these are not people that we're in competition with, they're actually us, that they're actually part of us. The same energy, they're just a different field of it. So why would we not, try to connect and understand each other?
Yeah, that's a good perspective. Well, I know I've taken a huge chunk of your time tonight.
I give it because I enjoy it. It's I have plenty to do. I have far too much to do, but I really enjoy these chances to talk in a very honest, open, I hope constructive way, advancing discussions rather than just, disagreeing.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have found these useful. The first one we did, and I'm very confident they'll find this one useful. I especially appreciate your willingness to address some of this mythicist stuff. I know we said up front we're not going to keep diving too deep on this. It's kind of like we just wanted to address it and move on to stuff like the Testimonium Flavianum.
Yeah.
But I appreciate your willingness to do it and kind of hopefully put it to bed for now. But I appreciate too your general sense of like you're bringing specific ideas, but you're also bringing like a stream of consciousness. I tend to think and at least write that way, as with emails. It's just like one thing leads to another, and you end up down some rabbit trails, but you also bring in some interesting topics as you do that. And I appreciate that's something you appreciate too. And I just definitely appreciate your willingness to share your insights, and especially your knowledge of Josephus and of the Bible. Those are just priceless to someone like me I'm like a kid in a candy shop saying, I gotta soak up what I can, I gotta learn. And your insights are just
me too. I'm the kid in the candy shop as well. So thank you very much, Tim. It's really been my honor, and I've enjoyed it immensely.